So let's take this terminology of regulation and dysregulation. I want to put it on a spectrum. And so on the left-hand side, we have hyperarousal. These are the students then that are dysregulated, but their behaviors are going to manifest in an outward expression. So these are the ones that are unable to focus. Now notice I said unable, and rather than won't. And again, these are the terminologies that I want to start honing in on. In fact, my keynote that I'm going to give on Thursday is all about the language of trauma, how we can really start tweaking how we see things and how we write reports up and how we hear the communication from our kids from a trauma lens. So instead of won't focus, we say unable to focus because the student's dysregulated. Just like when any of us are dysregulated, you can't focus. It's just that Billy is doing it chronically all the time. Cannot adhere to rules, aggressive, resistant, argumentative, anxious, impulsive, risk-taking. These are expressions of behavior that are really the core is dysregulation. So on the flip side of that, then you have the inward expression, which is just hypoarousal. These are the ones, again, inward, so they're defiant, they're withdrawn, they're tardy, they're absent. They disassociate, which just means they shut down. Did you see those little boys in the video? They were just shutting down. They had no expression on their face. It's a way to say, this outside world is way too much for me. I'm just going to shut down in my own little world to make sure I'm okay. And again, those are the ones that come in and just sit there and do nothing in your class. It's not that they're lazy, that they're dysregulated. Again, these words, I want you to start fine-tuning. And when you want to say, oh, Billy's just being lazy, well, maybe we just step back and go, maybe Billy's dysregulated. It is lazy. Sure, but what's the cause of it? Regulation then. What we want to do is help our kids get into this middle spot, because when you are regulated, you have a higher chance of being responsive, of being engaging, to be able to focus and be able to be calm. So we're always going to be wanting this behavior, but if we look at it from the lens of trauma, what we're going to do now is not look at it from a behavioral standpoint, we're going to look at it from a regulatory standpoint. So in order to get the behaviors that we ultimately want as the outcome, the process now is changing. The process will be about learning how to regulate. And that might be at a building-wide level. That might be at a classroom, just how you physically change the seating and the lighting and the things. And it might also be from an individual level. So there's lots of levels of figuring out how then to work with this whole concept of regulation versus dysregulation. And honestly, these two words can change everything. I went to a school, I'm from Boulder, Colorado, and I knew the principal and vice principal, and they asked me to come in and do just an in-service training. It was a K-8 school, and they had a lot of Billies at their school. And so I basically gave just what I just did right now and left. And I came back a year later, and they said, everything has changed. And I said, how has everything changed? They said, we finally just started looking at our Billies from a regulatory standpoint. We understand now it's about being dysregulated rather than being bad. And that was able to change how they then interacted with their kids. So negative behavior is a regulatory issue, not a behavioral issue. If we can start seeing it through this lens, this is where the magic happens. This is where we really can make the changes that we're looking for. So let's add in a little bit about the brain on this. Because the 90s were the decade of the brain, and I think that is our call to action. That is our call to say we have to start taking the science and weaving it into how we do things with children, because now we actually have proof of how the brain does start to develop in a very different way and what parts of the brain the kids are using when they are dysregulated. If you have any naysayers in your school, or you're still sitting there not quite convinced, it's always the science, I think, that you can't argue with. You can't argue with science. And so how then can we take that concept of regulation and dysregulation and apply it to the brain? Well, you've got basically three parts of the brain. The outer shell of the brain is the neocortex. Now, the neocortex is a part of the brain that is all about higher order thinking. This is the part of the brain that really separates us as humans from the animal kingdom. This is where we have the ability to have abstract thinking. We have morals and ethics are processed up here. Judgment, good or bad judgment, is processed up here. This is where we also have sequential thinking. Now, sequential thinking is important because so much of our disciplinary policies and models are based off of sequential thinking, right? So if A happens, Billy, then B will happen, and then C will ultimately be the result of all that. That takes sequential thinking. And what's important about that is when you are dysregulated, you're not in this part of the brain. So you can't actually think through these things. This part of the brain is also about right and wrong. And what distinguishes then the difference between Andy and Billy is that Billy is living more in the midbrain. And so the midbrain is all about not right or wrong, but win or lose. And so if you're in the midbrain, this is the emotional brain. This is the fear-based brain. This is the brain that says, I need it now, because time, by the way, doesn't exist. It's all about what happens in the next 15 seconds. Not about the future, not about the afternoon. Well, Billy, if you don't straighten up right now, you're going to have after-school detention. F you. Because right now in my brain as Billy, there's not an afternoon. It's about right now. This is the part of the brain that it's all about making my life okay. So this is where the amygdala is. And the amygdala is the fear receptor, and I think it gets a bad rap because it's also the pleasure-seeking part of the brain. And this is important to recognize because sometimes we don't want to let Billy off the hook because he's just doing this because he's just being greedy, or he's just, we put some bad words around that. Because let's say Billy steals the chocolate off your desk. And you Billy, you saw Billy steal the chocolate. And Billy says, no, I didn't steal the chocolate. And you're like, Billy, you stole the chocolate. No, I didn't steal the chocolate. Like, he lies so well, you even start creating your own story. Like, you question your own reality. Like, well, maybe I really didn't see him steal that chocolate. Who has kids who can lie? Like, right? Because it's all fear-based. It's all about, I have to protect myself. But it's also, I stole the chocolate because I just want to feel good. Now, you all have a story similar to that. You didn't steal the chocolate, but let me give you your story. So let's say at the beginning of the year, you decided to go on a, not really diet, but you want to go on a good eating plan. It was a lifestyle change, right? So your New Year's resolution was all about eating organic, no processed foods. You're going to eat salads. You're going to eat about energy. And then, I don't know, a week or so later, you got kind of hungry. And you're in the middle of the grocery store, and you know what those evil marketers do in the grocery store? On either side, the checkout, what do you got right there? The candy. And so you're like, ooh, I could use some candy right now because I'm pretty dysregulated. And so, but you have just enough of your neocortex to say, I'm going to get the peanut M&Ms because peanuts are healthy. So you take the peanuts and M&Ms, and you sit in the car, and you eat these peanut M&Ms. Now, they have dye. They have all sorts of things in them. You can't even read the label of the package. You can't even pronounce it, but you are eating these M&Ms, and they are so good. They are mighty M&Ms. They are awesome. They're magic. Now, your resolution was not to eat the M&Ms. And what are you doing right now? You are enjoying life, and it's all about right now. The problem is you wake up the next morning and you go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just did that. What was I thinking? You weren't thinking. You were in the midbrain. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about what I want, what I need right now. Now that's a kind of a cute example, but that's Billy all the time, all the time. And so you may work with Billy, and maybe Billy has a counselor or has done some group work, and Billy makes a commitment and signs a contract. Billy says, yeah, I'm not going to do that in class, and the next minute he gets into class, what does he do? The exact same thing he told himself he would not do because he's flipped now into the midbrain. So this is the emotional brain. Now, when we work with children and we don't understand their trauma and we don't understand the way that they're thinking, and they're in that midbrain, they will easily shift down into the reptilian brain. So how many of you all have children you have either worked with or seen or been a part of that are aggressive? Raise your hand. And move to the, oh, that's a large number, that move to the violent edge. We're definitely going to talk about that because I think that's one thing that we don't talk about enough. And so much that we do actually moves our students from the midbrain down into the reptilian brain. Now, there are going to be some of the students, but it's a very small percentage that just in a millisecond will go from the neocortex right down to the reptilian brain. But for the most part, so many of our students, if you look at the what I call progression to aggression, you might have a student who's mildly upset, you throw in a consequence threat, and they get upset, and then you get into a power struggle, so now you're in the midbrain. Remember, the midbrain is about win or lose, so if you get into a power struggle with a student who's in the midbrain, very likely, if you continue with that power struggle, and you just push at it, they're going to move down into the reptilian brain. I've actually got a video that we're going to see how that actually works in real life. So Andy is the student then that comes to school and maintains that ability to be in that neocortex most of the day, or at least that is the driving decision maker. I call that top-down control. So this is a student who comes to class. They might get upset, right? They might have some emotions, some feelings. That's the midbrain. But the dominant brain is the neocortex. So the dominant brain is going to be the decision maker. And so Andy can process through the discipline. Andy can go, well, if I don't get this paper done and turn it in and sit here and focus, I don't get to go to recess. Well, I'm going to then get my paper done, even if I don't want to do it. You see, the dominant brain is going to make decisions that work for us. But Billy is in the midbrain, so I call that a bottom-up control. So this is the student says, well, I don't want to do the paper, and I don't care what they think. I don't care if I fail, but I'm going to recess. So Billy doesn't do the paper, and the teacher said, well, you can't go to recess, and guess where Billy goes? Out the door to recess, because he says, you're not in charge of me, I am. So we have to start connecting with students in this midbrain. You know how you regulate the midbrain? How do you get a student from a bottom-up control to a top-down control? That's relationship. That's connection. That's understanding. Now, that all sounds nice and fluffy. There has to be some boundaries, and there has to be some expectations. And again, we'll get into the depth of what all that looks like as we go through this conference. It's not something just to put out there in one sentence. So you have to experience that. So I just also want to make sure you know this is not just some light, fluffy granola model. Like, you know, there's actually to have strong structure, to have strong expectations, to be able to handle Billy and say, no, that's not going to be the way it is, but we're going to love you through it. That actually is one of the best strategies as well, because that gives predictability. So holding some good boundaries and holding the rules is actually very important. But it's holding those boundaries within the context of the heart, holding that boundary to say, you're going to struggle when I say no, Billy. But you know what? We're going to be okay. But I'm still going to hold that boundary. I'm never giving up on you.